Hello everyone, this is Manohar Reddy, Department of Cybersecurity, Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. Today I am going to explain you the concept of problem solving on concept of ER model. Problem solving on ER model. So generally there are different types of models are there to design the database very efficiently. So to design the database, a database model or database design is to be in efficient way. So for that, what are the different types of models are there? So there are ER model is presented, relational model is presented, semi-structured model and hybrid model. So there are different types of models are there. But among that all, ER model is a very efficient model. And why it is say that it is a high conceptual model. So now we are going to discuss about this model. So what is meant by ER model actually? So ER model, ER stands for what? Entity relationship. So ER model stands for an entity relationship model, and it is a high level data model. And this model is used to define the data elements and relationship for a specified system. So the entities and the relationship must be available in the ER model, and that defines the data elements and relationship for a specified system. So which contains both data elements and relationships, both are there. It develops a conceptual design for the database. And it also develops a very simple and easy to design view of data. So it develops a conceptual design, that is nothing but what? The logical thinking of the designation of the database. And it also develops a very simple and easy to design view. So the concept view of the data as well as design view of the data. So both are developed a very simple and easy to design view of data. In ER modeling, the database structure is portrayed. As a diagram called entity relationship diagram. The database structure is portrayed as a diagram called entity relationship diagram. So the database structure is portrayed as the structure is called as entity relationship diagram. And for example, suppose we design a school database. We want to design a school database. In this database, the student will be an entity with attributes. Like what? Address, name, ID, age. These are all attributes of the school database and student entity. So student will be an entity. Then the attributes are like address, name, ID, age, etc. These are all the attributes of an entity called student. The address can be another entity with attributes like a city, street name, pin code, etc. So the address is also will be taken as an entity, and that contains like a city, street name, pin code, like that. And there will be a relationship between all these. So how the ER model can have the structure? So here there are three types of elements are there. That is first one entity, the second one is what? Attribute, and third one is what? Relation. So first one is what? Entity. So generally entity is nothing but what? It is a physical object. Entity is nothing but what? Physical object, a real world object which defines the behavior or which defines the property. And next one, attribute. So attribute is nothing but it is a property of an entity. And the relationship. Relation is nothing but a logical association between two entities. So now Here there are different types of entities out there. So based on the type of entity, we can categorize weak entity and a strong entity. And similarly, attribute is categorized as key attribute, composite attribute, multi-valued attribute, and a derived attribute. And similarly, the relations are existed one-to-one relationship, one-to-many relationship, many-to-one relationship, and many-to-many relationship. So like that, the different forms of elements are structured in the ER model. So let us discuss each one by one entity and its types, attribute and its types, and relation its types. So what is meant by an entity? An entity may be any object. An entity may be any object, class or person or place. So entity may be an object, so which shows the identity of itself. In the ER diagram, in the entity relationship diagram, an entity can be represented as rectangles. Entity can be represented as rectangles. So here, consider an organization as an example. So take an example as organization which contains what? Manager, product, employee, department. All these are the entities. All these will be treated as an entities for the organization. And here, considering this example, an employee and a department, those two are an entities. Those two are entities. And here, the employee entity works for department entity. Here, the works for is the relationship. Works for is the relationship and the type. And here, the entity shows the symbol which is an rectangle symbol. And here, the types are there. So first one is what? A weak entity. An entity that entity depends on another entity called weak entity. So if any entity is depending on other entity, then it will be called as weak entity. The weak entity does not contain any key attributes of its own. So a weak entity is always trying to say it is depending on other entities. So it does not have a key attribute. And the weak entity is represented by a double rectangle. So here, this is an weak entity because it is depending on, the weak entity is depending on this primary entity. This is a primary entity or key entity. This is a primary entity or strong entity, we can say that, or key entity also. So key entity. So here the installment is weak entity which is depending on this lone entity, which is depending on the lone entity. So here this will be represented in the symbol called a double rectangle. Double rectangle. The next one, second one, strong entity. So strong entity is nothing but what? The attribute which contains primary key as an entity. The entity which has a primary key, it is says that strong entity, and it does not depend on any other entity. So which is derived for other entities, but not it is depending on other entities, and it can be represented using a single rectangle. It can be represented using a single thick rectangle. So it is not like a double rectangle, it is a thick rectangle. The relationship between two strong entities can be represented using a single diamond like this one. So here in the previous example, we shown that what employee department is works for the department. So here the two strong entities are related with a symbol called diamond symbol, or it is a relationship symbol. It can either have a participation or no participation. So it can either have total participation or no participation. And second one, attribute. So the attribute is used to describe the property of an entity. Attribute is used to describe the property of an entity. Eclipse symbol is used to represent an attribute. So ellipse symbol is used to represent an attribute. For example, here ID, age, contact number, name, etc. can be the attributes of student. So take an example as a student entity. So student is an entity. For this entity, the student can have the phone number, student can have the ID, student can have the name, as well as student can have the age. So all these other entities, all these other attributes are the properties of this student entity. So here all these attributes will be treated as indicated in the form of ellipse symbol. Ellipse symbol. Next one, key attribute. So key attribute is used to represent the main characteristics of an entity. The key attribute is used to represent the main characteristics of an entity, and it represents a primary key. So the key attribute is nothing but what? Primary key. So it is represented by an ellipse with text underlined. So an ellipse with text underlined. So here the consider student is an entity which contains the attributes like ID and phone number and age and name. Among these all other entities, among these all other attributes, the ID is only the attribute which is underlined with the text. Which is underlined with the text. So here the text underlined attribute is called as what? Key attribute. And the second one, next one, composite attribute. An attribute that composed of many other attributes is known as composite attributes. So the attribute it composed of many other attributes is known as what? Composite attribute. So it represented by an ellipse, and those ellipses are connected with the main ellipse. So all other derived attributes are connected with the main attribute, which is called with the main composite attribute. So these are all the main attributes. And multi-valued attribute. So here an attribute can have more than one values. These attributes are known as multi-valued attribute. These values are known as multi-valued attribute. The double vowel is used to represent multi-valued attribute. For example, a student can have more than one phone number. So here the phone number is the entity, phone number is the attribute, and which can have more than one values. The derived attribute. So in this derived attribute, an attribute can be derived from other attribute is known as derived attribute. And it can be represented by a dashed ellipse symbol. So it can be represented by dashed ellipse symbol. For example, a person's age changes over time and can be derived from another attributes like date of birth. So here the student is an entity which contains name, birth date, roll number and age are the attributes. But here the age attribute is depending on birth date, because if you give the birth value like 14/6/1999, then you can say that the age of the student. So here the age attribute is dependent attribute which is depending on birth date attribute. So that is the derived attribute. And next, relationship. So a relationship is nothing but what? A logical connection or logical association. So logical connection or logical association among two entities. So here a relationship is used to describe the relation between entities. Describe the relation between entities. Diamond or rhombus symbol is used to represent the relationship. Diamond or rhombus symbol is used to represent the relationship. So here the teacher is an entity, student is an entity. So teacher teaches student, teacher teaches student. So here the teacher student, in between that the teachers is the relation name. Teachers is the relationship name. So teacher teaches the relationship name with the student. So there are different types of relationships out there. So first one is what? One-to-one relationship. One-to-one relationship. So here when only one instance of an entity is associated with the relationship, then it is known as one-to-one relationship. So when only one instance of an entity is associated with the relationship, then it is known as one-to-one relationship. So here, for example, a female can marry to one male. A female can marry to one male, and similarly a male can marry to one female. So here the female and the male, those two are the entities. And this entity have the relationship with one instance of an entity. So with one instance of an entity. So there may be a chance to use only one. So here the female married to male and male married to female with the instance of only once. So that is about the one-to-one relationship. And the second one is what? One-to-many relationship. So here, when only one instance of the entity on the left, and more than one instance of an entity on the right. So only one instance of the entity of the left and more than one instance of an entity on the right side associates with the relationship, then this is known as one-to-many relationship. For example, a scientist can invent many inventions. But the invention is done by the only specific scientist. So invention is done by the only specific scientist. So here the scientist is and invention is both are entities. So scientist is an entity and invention is an entity. So scientist invents an invention, more than one inventions, or he can invent one. So scientist can invent more than one or one invented. So multiple inventions are invented by only one scientist. So like that, one-to-many relationships are. And the second one, many-to-one relationship. When more than one instance of an entity on the left side, so when more than one instance, more than one indicates that what? M. So more than one instance of an entity on the left side and only one instance of an entity on the right side is associates with a relationship, then it is known as many-to-one relationship. For example, a student enrolls for only one course, but a course can have many students. So student enroll for one course, but a course can have many students. So the multiple students are enrolling for particular course, or more than one students are able to register for the multiple courses also. So enrolling courses for also. So that is the way many-to-one relationship exists. And many-to-many relationship. So when more than one instance of an entity, so this is also an entity and this is also an entity. So more than one instance, so multiple instance of an entity, multiple instance of an entity is related with multiple instance of another entity, multiple instance of another entity. So multiple instances of another entity is called as what? Many to many relationship. So here, when more than one instance of the entity on the left and more than one instance of an entity on the right associate with relationship, then it is known as many to many relationship. Then it is known as many to many relationship. For example, an employee can assign by many projects, and the project can have many employees also. So more than one employees are assigned to more than one projects, or else more than one projects are assigned to the more than one employees. So like the way the many to many relationship exist among those two entities, So this is about many to many relationship, and once again we revise the topic which we discussed in this session. So here the ER model. So what is meant by ER model, and how an ER models existed in between those two, and what are the different types of attributes will be there, entities will be there, and relations will be there. So generally ER model stands for what? Entity relationship model, which is a high level data model, and use it to define the data elements and relationships for specified system. And it develops a conceptual design of the database. And it is used to simple and easy to view of the data. So here the database structure is portrayed as like entity relationship diagram. For example, take an example as a student. A student is an entity which contains the like a student number, phone number, and a student address, student roll number, and a student name. So here the name, phone number, address, and roll number are the different attributes. So here the entities are represented with the different entities like weak entity, strong entity, and attributes are derived with the different key attribute, composite attribute, multi-valued attribute, and derived attributes. And the relations are one to one relationship, one to many relationship, many to one relationship, and many to many relationship. So here the entity is nothing but what? A real world class or object which shows the behavior of the attributes, which shows the behavior of the object also. And here there are two types of entities are there. One is weak entity and the second one is strong entity. So weak entities are always depending on the strong entities. So here the weak entity is represented with a symbol like double rectangle symbol. But in the strong entities represented in the symbol of thick rectangle. And one more thing we are going to see here, the strong entity is always a primary key. Which is not depending on other entities. And the second one is attribute. So attribute describes the property of an entity. The attribute describes the property of an entity. So which have the different types of attributes are there. So key attributes, derived attributes, multi-valued attributes, all these attributes will be having under the attribute. So here the key attribute. So key attribute is nothing but what? The attribute which is acting as which is having the characteristics of as a primary key. Then it is say that key attribute. So identified as what? Text underlined attribute. Text underlined attribute is key attribute. And here the composite attribute. So the composite attribute is nothing but what? An attribute can create more than one values, more than one attributes, or more than one other attributes. Then it is say that what? Composite attribute. And multi-valued attribute. So multi-valued attribute is nothing but what? An attribute which can have more than one values. An attribute which can have more than one values. Then it is say that multi-valued attribute. Then it is say that multi-valued attribute. And derived attribute is nothing but what? An attribute which is derived from another attribute. An attribute which is derived from another attribute. Suppose here the birth date is an attribute and the age is an attribute, but age is derived from birth date. If you know the birth date of an entity, then you can say that the age of an entity. So that is the derived attribute of the entity. And next one, relationship. So what is meant by relationship, and how many types of relationships are existed to in between the entities. So here the entities must be maintained with the symbol called rhombus symbol is a relationship symbol, and here the types are one-to-one relationship. That means one instance on the left side of an entity and one instance on the right side of an entity will be related to each other. So then it is called as what? One-to-one relationship. And the second one to many relationship. Second one is what? One to many relationship. That indicates that what? One instance of an entity from the left side and multiple instance of an entity on the right side. One instance of the entity on the left side and multiple instances on the right side of an entity that are related to each other. Then it is called as what? One to many relationship. And next, third one, many to one relationship. Many to one relationship. So here the more than one instances are nothing but multiple instances of an entity on the left side. Multiple instances of an entity on the left side and only one instance of an entity on the right side. Only one instance of an entity on the right side will relate to each other. Then it is called as what? A many to one relationship. Many to one relationship. And last one, many to many relationship. So here the more than one instance are nothing but multiple instances of an entity on the left side, multiple instances of an entity on the right side. So multiple instances of the entity on left side, multiple instances of an entity on the right side will be having a relation to each other. Then it is called as what? Many to many relationship. So like the way ER model. So because of all these entities, attributes, relationships are properly structured. Because of the properly structured, the ER model is the conceptual model, high level conceptual model. ER model is the high level conceptual model. So which shows the behaviors, which shows the structure, which shows the all other properties. So this is all about to entity relationship model. So based on that we can design the database in this way. We can design the database in this way. So thank you all.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.